Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Mike Wimsatt. I serve as Director of the Waste Management Division for the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. And joining me today, I have Assistant Commissioner of our department, Mark Sanborn. Thank you for the opportunity to testify regarding House Bill 56. As you've heard from the bill sponsor, this bill would essentially require DES to establish a site-specific setback distance for proposed new landfills from any perennial surface waters. And it provides that setback distance shall be sufficient to keep any groundwater that's been contaminated by the landfill from reaching any nearby surface waters within a 5-year period. And the way that it goes about establishing that setback distance is to have an independent hydrogeologist do site-specific testing on the site and determine in order to estimate groundwater seepage velocity. And then using the highest seepage velocity estimated for the site, that is used to determine the 5-year setback distance. And also the bill does provide, which I'll speak to in a moment, it provides for the establishment of project improvement allowances. And each of those can add, basically to offset a 1-year travel time distance for up to 3 years. So the sponsor did make reference to an amendment, but I have not seen that amendment, so my testimony will not address the content of the amendment. DES has several concerns with the bill, the provisions of the bill as it's been introduced. First, it's not clear to us how the 5-year travel time distance has been established as the appropriate standard. We've expressed, even going back to last year, some concern that it may have an impact on whether any future landfill sites will be available in the state. We just don't know that at this point, so that's a concern that we have. Second, the provision that requires the use of the highest estimated rate is a little unclear to us how that will be implemented, but based on how we understand groundwater hydrogeologic testing to take place on sites, it seems possible to us that an individual measurement could be made in a particular area of soil on a site, and that using that particular measurement could result in erroneously identifying a setback distance that is actually much greater than would actually need. In other words, you might end up making an estimate of groundwater seepage velocity that is much faster than the actual velocity of groundwater traveling to a particular surface water. So we're a little concerned about how the bill would instruct the hydrogeologists and DES to establish that groundwater seepage velocity. And then lastly, there's not a lot of detail related to these project improvement allowances, and it's unclear to DES what specific actions or improvements are intended by that, and we think that would require further specificity. And the other thing I would say is that we are, and everyone knows that there are a number of bills in play before the legislature this year regarding this topic of landfill setbacks, particularly to surface water. The agency is monitoring a bill, Senate Bill 61, which is somewhat similar to this bill. And there's some talk, as we understand it, and I think I wasn't present for it, but I understand maybe an amendment was approved this morning by the Senate committee, which would combine this Senate Bill 61 with Senate Bill 227, which is a bill that would essentially instruct DES to hire a consultant or contractor to do an independent critical evaluation of setback requirements in the existing rule and make recommendations for changes. And we believe that both of these bills could actually, particularly if they're combined, could provide a good, effective strategy for protecting surface waters and determining what appropriate landfill setbacks would be from surface waters. And I'll leave it at that and be happy to take any questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just add really quickly, again, for the record, Mark Sanborn, Assistant Commissioner, New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. Given this topic and how many bills there have been and how long this is going on, we've been often asked, our positions. And as the director indicated, DES believes the best path forward is the combined version of SB 61 and SB 227. Therefore, on the remaining House and any Senate bills that have been presented on this were not supportive of moving forward in a different direction other than SB 61 combined with 227, SB 227, and how that indicates that would have us move forward. So we think that's in the best interest of the state and in the best interest of dealing with this issue. With that, we're happy to take questions.
Thank you. I have a question as to, are you aware of any other states that use this 5-year travel distance measurement?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I'm aware that the state of Maine does have some similar language. It has some, as with every state has a different sort of structure and organization to their rules, so they aren't necessarily directly comparable. But I understand that Maine does have a similar provisions in its rules.
And do you know how long they've had this provision in law for them at all?
I don't know specifically. I think it's been in law for quite some time. And I understand that there are a number of, we have had, last year we had some conversations with our colleagues in Maine and came to understand that the way that they implement the law, I can't say I completely understand it, but it was a little different than what we were reading in this law or in this bill or in bills that were before the legislature.
In discussions with your colleagues in Maine, have you found that they've had any problems implementing it, or haven't had any problems with it in general?
I'm not sure I can answer that. I understand that they do have a provision for providing variances to various provisions of the rules, and I don't really understand what the history is on providing those variances.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Representative Germana.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question, and it's to piggyback on the chairwoman's question with regard to Maine or in other states with your second listed concern about the possibility of getting seepage velocity measurement in one place, which is inaccurate. How is it done in other places? Is there, I would have assumed, but perhaps out of naivete or ignorance, that there is a procedure that would involve taking measures in numerous places in order to try to determine an average of seepage velocity, et cetera. So is there in Maine or elsewhere a standard way to attain an accurate measure?
I apologize. I don't specifically know how Maine accomplishes that. My testimony on this bill was based on the way we read the language in this bill, and to put a little bit more flesh on that concern, it would appear that a seepage velocity is something that can be determined in a relatively small area of soil, and there are published methods for making those estimates, doing field measurements and making those estimates. And of course, certainly the geology in New Hampshire is very variable. The formations are very heterogeneous, and the idea that one individual test in one area of soil would then be used to determine the path and both the pathway and the velocity of groundwater over what could be a very large distance that sees a lot of soil changes just doesn't seem sound to us as we look at it.
May I follow up?
Sure.
And would you, with reference to the Senate bills and the idea of getting a hydrogeologist to consult, I imagine this would be one of the things that you would be looking for that consultant to provide feedback on?
Sure. If you're referencing Senate Bill 227, yes, we think that part of that study very likely should include a review of the neighboring states, of the region's state rules, and a critical assessment of those to determine what might be appropriate and applicable for use by New Hampshire.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Knapp.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. You referenced the project improvement allowances in your letter, or the Commissioner does. And I know you said you didn't have the amendment in front of you, but the amendment references those including additional control technology, monitoring programs, or funding guarantees that the department believes may increase the effective safety of the project. So do you believe DES is capable of evaluating what those additional improvements might be and changing the travel time or adjusting it based on that, or giving credits for that?
I have no doubt that our staff could come up with what they think are appropriate things to consider. When I compare the bill to Senate Bill 61, for example, Senate Bill 61 sets out much more specifically what those might look like. And really the nature of the comment in this letter of testimony is that the language in this bill is not very specific. And what we're really suggesting is much more specificity is helpful. Because obviously when we go to rulemaking, we do the very best we can to do an honest assessment and interpretation of the law, but to the extent that the law is a little more specific, it gives us a lot better direction.
Thank you.
And I just want to add to that point, that's at the heart of the reason we feel the combined version of 61 and 227, SB 227, is the best approach forward as the folks who are going to be asked to implement this, because it allows us to work with, we put out an RFP, we would have hired consultants who would have specific tasks to look at, we'd have the research we needed, the data we needed, before we go into assuming what the rulemaking should look like. We think that's just a much more effective way of managing this issue so that we can be sure what we bring forward in rulemaking is in the best interest of all the policies impacting the state of New Hampshire.
Representative Bixby.
Yes, so under your current permitting requirements for landfills and for landfill expansions, do you require any hydrogeological assessments of groundwater velocity or seepage velocity?
Certainly, for any proposed expansion or newly sited landfill, there is a detailed hydrogeological study that is required, and that would, I don't know if groundwater seepage velocity, I don't know whether it is specifically listed in the rules, but the rules do require collection of a lot of detailed information regarding hydrogeology and the kinds of hydrogeologic parameters and characteristics that would be measured and evaluated would lead you to being able to determine that.
Follow up.
Would those procedures provide a better model for the measurement than this bill does?
I'm not sure how to answer that, because the current rules don't envision calculating a travel time distance from the landfill footprint to a surface water, at least not specifically. So to the extent that a future paradigm for these rules includes calculating a travel time distance, there may well need to be some additional instruction or direction provided for that.
Follow up.
Yes, so what is the purpose of the current seepage assessments that you do?
The overall purpose is to understand the site in a detailed way in terms of its hydrogeology, its stratigraphy, and how groundwater, both from a drainage, a surface water and a groundwater drainage standpoint, but also contaminant transport. A lot of it is about making sure that a effective and protective groundwater monitoring network can be established around the site. And in order to do that, you need to have an understanding of what the subsurface environment looks like. So you want to understand what the stratigraphy is, what the layering and deposits of sand and gravel and clay and silt might be, because that helps instruct you on how you, on being able to demonstrate that you can effectively monitor potential releases from the site, and then how to actually construct and install that monitoring network.
One more follow-up. Yeah.
And is the goal of that monitoring network to make sure that there is nothing going into the groundwater at that site, or is it in terms of making sure that nothing travels away from the site, or is it both?
I think it's probably both. What we're trying to do with any landfill, and we start with the design of the landfill to ensure that leachate from the landfill is collected effectively and stored and processed properly, and that any leachate that the landfill generates is collected by, in the first instance, the primary liner, or failing that, the secondary liner. And so the monitoring, the groundwater monitoring that we do around the landfill, basically there's a requirement to understand what the current conditions are prior to construction of the landfill cell in terms of how groundwater flows, but also what the quality of the groundwater is, so the geochemical parameters of the groundwater. And then when you go into monitoring, you're required to do periodic monitoring under your groundwater release detection permit for a landfill. And then whenever you go concentrations of any contaminants or geochemical parameters go above the established background, that launches the applicant and the holder of the permit into more intensive monitoring to determine, you know, what the trend is, and to determine whether there's been a release from the landfill. And then if there's been a release from the landfill, there's a requirement to go into active remedial steps to stop that release and contain it.
Thank you.
I have a question to piggyback on that as well as your answer. So with what you've just described, how would you do that within a current 200-foot setback?
Well, what I think a lot of people don't understand is that we have Sentry monitoring wells immediately adjacent to the landfill liner. So basically, if you were to look at a footprint of a landfill, immediately adjacent to that, often within 50 feet of that, there are monitoring wells that are monitored to determine groundwater quality immediately adjacent and outside of the liner. So those, and we sometimes do see detections of contaminants that cause us concern. We've not seen them as a result of liner leaks. What we've seen is that in some cases, surface water runoff from the landfill may, because of a mistake or an error, may contact waste and contribute some contaminants to the groundwater, or in some cases the surface water runoff that goes into discharge basins, surface water infiltration basins around the landfill. And the good news is that we see those results very, very quickly, and there are some examples where we've identified that and then required immediately the landfill operator to investigate. They find out where the mistake has been made or where the problem is occurring. They fix it, and then we see the groundwater restored to meet groundwater quality, that the pre-existing groundwater quality. In many cases, what we've observed isn't even above a drinking water standard. It's just above what we saw in the background groundwater. And so we see it early enough to then go and require corrective measures, and then we continue to monitor as that groundwater quality is restored to the background quality.
And do you have an idea of how long those corrective measures take to implement?
Well, I think it really depends on the circumstance. In many cases, the actual corrective measure doesn't take very long. It's the time taken to figure out what's going on. So in some cases, we may have several months or a few quarters of monitoring before we actually get to the bottom of the problem and then implement some kind of a solution.
Okay, thank you. Representative Knapp.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do you know about when the 200-foot setback was enacted, and when was the last time standards around landfall sightings were changed or updated?
I'm sorry, could you say the second part of your question again?
I'm just sort of curious as to the history of regulations around landfill siting. So you have a 200-foot setback currently, right?
Right.
How long has that been in existence? And is that the last time that laws around landfill siting were updated?
I think, I don't know how long that 200-foot setback has been there. I know it's been there for quite some time. It's many years, I believe, but I don't know how many. I don't believe we've had, we did do a rulemaking back in, I think, around 2014, where there was some setback requirements, but I don't believe they were related to surface water. I think they were related to roads and residences and private property and that sort of thing.
Representative Bixby?
So, do you think that 200-foot setback is appropriate, or do you think it needs to be revisited?
Well, I'm to be really candid, I'm anxious to see. We are hopeful that the study that's envisioned by Senate Bill 227 will be implemented, and I'm anxious to hear what a third-party expert has to say about these setbacks. Important to understand that in practice, that setback has typically really only been applied to wetland and very minor surface water features. I don't think we have. I'm really not aware that we have any landfill footprints that are just at 200, just at that setback, 200 feet from a particular surface water. So it's what I will tell you is that we don't have examples of perennial surface waters being impacted above surface water quality standards by contaminants from the currently operating landfills.
Thank you.
Representative Dutsey?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I just want a point of clarification. Mr. Wimsatt, did you say that based on this bill, you would find it hard to maybe cite any landfills in the state?
No, I think, thank you for the question, Representative. I think what I said was that it's not clear to us if you were to implement this bill as introduced, whether what that would mean for future landfill siting in the state. We're not sure that, given the way that New Hampshire geology is and the way that the occurrence of surface waters in the state, it's unclear to us what sites might meet the criteria that are set out in this bill.
Follow up, Madam Chair?
Sure.
Yeah, the reason I asked the question is because we've been given a map based on only 1/7 of New Hampshire is excluded by the 5-year groundwater system, and the source was New Hampshire DES 2011.
Yes,
so I mean, there's some kind of a conflicting thing. So
There certainly is. I'm familiar with that map. I can tell you that the gentleman at DES who made that map was very dismayed to see how it was being used with respect to a bill last year and this year. That, as I understand it, is a stratified drift aquifer map. It does not purport to identify areas where a 5-year travel time distance would exist. The reality is that is so site specific. We don't have anywhere near the information we would need to make a map like that. So that map is really being misused and it's misleading people.
Thank you. Representative Germano?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question is, not having seen Senate Bill 227, what is the timeline on that bill in terms of a report back?
My understanding, and I think there's been an amendment that combined that bill with Senate Bill 61. I've not had a chance to sit down and read that amendment. I think the original version of Senate Bill 227 puts it at about completing the study on the order of, in time to do rulemaking within 2 years. That's my understanding.
Thank you. May I follow up, Madam Chair?
Yes.
Thank you. And in general, how long does it take to site a landfill, right? So the legislation refers to any proposed new landfill. So roughly from the time that a company were to propose siting a landfill and the time that permission is granted, roughly how long does that take?
Sure, that's a tough question to answer. If you just look at the law, you would conclude that basically an application comes in, and if everything's perfect, we approve it. We find the application complete within 60 days, and then we render a decision within 120 days. In practice, for such a big undertaking as proposing and siting a newly sited greenfields landfill, the chances of that application being complete upon first submittal are slim. Not because applicants do a poor job of submitting, but there's just a lot that you have to provide. So we would do a review and determine what things were missing, and then we would ask for those new information to be provided, and then that would come in, and then the clock starts over again. In practice, it's probably a 2-year process. It
I
could be more.
appreciate, oh, I'm sorry, thank you.
I am gonna warn you that, we should not be talking, discussing Senate bills, especially we don't have anything in front of us about it, so, I would like to suspend any discussion about that Senate bills that were considered or voted on, please. Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, I wanna thank you for your testimony this afternoon.